The early morning sun spilled golden light across Martin Caldwell's front yard, illuminating the neat rows of flowers lining the stone pathway that led to his porch. At 91 years old, Martin moved with deliberate care, his footsteps measured and steady, the kind of pace that comes not only from age but from years of experience and self-discipline. In his right hand, he held a wooden cane, not entirely necessary for his balance, but something his daughter, Emily, had insisted upon after a minor fall he'd taken last winter. Martin had agreed, more to humor her than out of need, though he had to admit it wasn't unpleasant to have the sturdy weight of the cane under his hand. Every morning followed the same ritual, a routine as constant and comforting as the rising sun. Rain or shine, Martin began his day with a private ceremony, a raising of the flag in the small patch of lawn at the front of his house. It was his personal tribute to the men he had fought alongside in Normandy during World War II, some of whom never made it back. The ritual was quiet, reverent, and deeply personal. His arthritic fingers moved deftly along the rope, securing the stars and stripes before hoisting it up the pole with precision that had not dulled despite the passage of time. As the flag unfurled in the morning breeze, Martin took a step back, straightened his posture as best he could, and offered a small salute. It was a solemn moment, unobserved by the neighbors but no less significant. The neighbors, of course, saw him every morning, standing tall in his burgundy cardigan, pressed beige trousers, and black loafers that gleamed in the sunlight. His polished shoes were a source of quiet pride, a habit formed during his years in the military. Each Sunday evening, Martin would sit in his well-worn armchair and meticulously shine them. It wasn't about appearances, though he was always neat and presentable, but about tradition. The ritual of caring for his shoes was a way to stay connected to the discipline and order that had defined so much of his life. Today was Wednesday, and for Martin, that meant spending time in the backyard with his azaleas. The garden had become his sanctuary in the years since his beloved wife Eleanor passed away. Tending to the plants gave him a sense of purpose and continuity, a reason to step outside and get his hands dirty. Eleanor had always loved the garden, and every flower, every carefully pruned bush, was a reminder of the life they had built together. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," came a cheerful voice, and Martin turned to see Lily, the bright-eyed 11-year-old from down the street, zipping by on her scooter. She was waving enthusiastically, her pigtails bouncing as she passed. Martin raised a hand in return, his face lighting up with a smile. Lily had helped him plant sunflower seeds last spring, and she often stopped to check on their progress. The children in the neighborhood had taken to calling him Grandpa Martin, a title he cherished even though he had no grandchildren of his own. Emily and her husband had never been able to have children, but the neighborhood kids had adopted Martin in their own way, filling his days with a warmth he hadn't expected. Reaching the small wooden shed at the edge of his yard, Martin retrieved his gardening gloves and pruning shears. The gloves were old, worn thin in places, but they held sentimental value. Eleanor had given them to him on their 45th wedding anniversary, laughing as she handed them over with a playful scolding about his tendency to ruin his shirt sleeves in the rose bushes. Every time he slid his hands into the gloves, he could almost hear her voice, and for a moment, it was as though she were still beside him. As he crouched among the azaleas, carefully clipping away dead branches and pulling stubborn weeds, Martin's mind wandered back to his days as a young soldier. He was barely out of his teens when he shipped out to Europe, a wide-eyed farm boy who had never been more than 50 miles from home. Normandy had been brutal, and the memories of that time often lingered at the edges of his thoughts, but amid the chaos, he had found an unexpected refuge. During lulls in the fighting, he and his comrades had helped the local villagers tend their gardens. The simple act of planting and nurturing life had been a powerful reminder that even in the midst of destruction, beauty could endure. That lesson had stayed with him through all the years that followed. A sudden honk of a car horn broke through his reverie. Martin straightened slowly, wincing as his back protested the movement. It was Mrs. Greer from the corner house, driving her grandson to school in her familiar red station wagon. She gave her usual 2 cheerful honks as she passed, and Martin waved in return, his smile widening as he watched the car disappear down the street. The morning unfolded in a quiet rhythm as Martin worked in his garden, the sun climbing higher in the sky. He spoke softly to the azaleas as he tended them, sharing stories about Eleanor or bits of neighborhood gossip. Some might have found it odd, an old man chatting with his flowers, but Martin understood something they didn't. Gardens, like people, thrived on attention and care. And for Martin, that care was a way to honor the past while finding peace in the present. At precisely 10:30 a.m., Martin went inside for his mid-morning coffee. Eleanor's old porcelain cups still rested on the kitchen shelf, arranged just as she had left them. Martin always used her favorite, the one adorned with delicate blue violets, matching the flowers she once loved to grow by the garden gate. He added a teaspoon of sugar and a small splash of cream, the same way he had prepared his coffee every day for the past 60 years. With his cup in hand, Martin settled into his worn leather armchair by the large bay window, which offered him a clear view of his front yard. The American flag fluttered gently in the spring breeze, the freshly pruned azaleas bursting with vibrant shades of pink and white. The sunlight bathed the scene in a golden glow, painting an image of serenity. This was Martin's sanctuary, a peaceful corner of the world earned through decades of service, hard work, and love. What Martin didn't know was that this quiet Wednesday morning would mark the end of that peace. Unseen and unimagined, a storm of chaos was gathering just beyond the horizon, one that would soon invade his tranquil life. It wouldn't be long before the rumble of distant engines would cut through the stillness, bringing with them a clash of noise, disruption, and danger. But for now, Martin Caldwell sipped his coffee and watched his azaleas sway softly in the breeze, blissfully unaware that his calm and ordered world was about to be tested in a way it hadn't been since he returned from the battlefields of Europe. The peace of Martin Street shattered the following afternoon. The disruption came as a low, throaty growl in the distance, gradually rising in volume until it rattled the glass panes of his bay window. The sound was unmistakable, the roar of motorcycles. Martin set his coffee cup down and moved toward the window. His tired eyes widened as 5 motorcycles tore down the street, their engines roaring like an angry storm. Martin watched them slow, circle back, and finally pull into the lot of the old warehouse across the street. The warehouse had been empty for nearly 3 years, ever since the automotive repair shop that once occupied it had shuttered its doors. The building was a ghost of its former self, its facade covered in graffiti and its windows boarded up with planks worn gray by time. But now, it seemed the warehouse was coming alive again, though not in a way Martin, or anyone in the neighborhood, would have hoped. More motorcycles arrived, their riders clad in black leather jackets emblazoned with a red Cobra insignia. Within an hour, the bikes had multiplied. 5 became 15, then 20, and still they kept coming. Through his window, Martin watched as the men pried open the chained doors of the warehouse with crowbars. Their leader, a tall, imposing figure with a shaved head and a thick salt and pepper beard, barked orders to the others, gesturing with a steel-tipped boot. Across the street, Mrs. Greer hurried by with her golden retriever, her pace quick and her head low. She didn't glance at the bikers, even when one of them whistled and another shouted something crude. Martin's jaw tightened as he remembered the kindness Mrs. Greer had shown just last week when she'd brought him a loaf of her homemade banana bread. That night, Martin barely slept. The warehouse that had once been silent and forgotten was now alive with chaos. Music blared so loudly it drowned out the chirping crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Laughter, shouts, and the clinking of bottles carried through the still night air. Twice, Martin heard the sharp sound of shattering glass, and once, what might have been the crack of a fist against metal. The next morning, the aftermath was clear. Beer bottles littered the street, broken shards glinting in the morning sun. Trash bags, apparently dumped out for no reason, spilled across front lawns. Martin stepped outside and spotted Mark, the father of the young girl from down the street, picking up cans from his yard with a weary expression. "Good morning, Martin," Mark called, though his tone lacked its usual cheer. "Morning," Martin replied, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Rough night." Mark nodded, tossing an empty beer bottle into a garbage bag. "Barely slept." "You?" Martin shook his head. "Not a wink." "Have you called the police?" Mark asked, glancing nervously over his shoulder toward the warehouse. "3 times, Martin replied, frustration creeping into his voice. "They said unless someone files a formal complaint or a law is broken, there's nothing they can do." Mark sighed, lowering his voice. "Listen, Martin, maybe take it easy today. Don't raise the flag. These guys, they don't strike me as the respectful type." Martin's eyes flicked toward the flagpole in his yard, where the stars and stripes waved proudly in the morning breeze. His expression hardened, his jaw setting in the determined way it had all those decades ago when he faced challenges that required more than words. "We'll see about that," he said quietly, turning toward his house without another word. But Martin wouldn't change his routine. He'd faced far greater threats on the battlefields of Europe. At precisely 7 a.m., as always, he stepped outside, the flag folded neatly under his arm. The morning air was crisp, the dew on the grass sparkling in the sunlight. Martin attached the flag to the rope with steady hands, his focus unbroken until the sharp roar of a motorcycle engine shattered the stillness. "Hey, Grandpa," a coarse voice shouted. "That's a nice little lawn you got there." Martin turned his head toward the warehouse, where a burly biker wearing the red Cobra insignia straddled his bike. Before Martin could respond, the biker revved his engine and shot across the street, tearing a jagged path through Martin's well-manicured grass. Deep tire tracks scarred the soft earth as the man cackled, circling back to join his companions by the warehouse. As the day went on, the bikers grew bolder. More motorcycles arrived, the noise of their engines merging into a constant, deafening rumble. They called themselves the Crimson Vipers, and their presence began to suffocate the neighborhood. Children vanished from front yards. Mrs. Greer no longer waved her cheery morning greeting. Windows stayed shuttered, curtains drawn tight against the chaos. From his bay window, Martin watched as the bikers transformed the abandoned warehouse into their stronghold. They hung a massive banner bearing the Cobra emblem over the entrance and littered the loading dock with mismatched couches and discarded furniture. The air rang with the sound of smashing bottles, raucous laughter, and shouted curses. That afternoon, Martin stepped into his yard to repair the damage. With his garden tools in hand, he carefully filled the tire tracks with soil, tamping it down with his foot. He was focused on the task when three bikers swaggered toward his fence. The leader, a tall, imposing figure with a shaved head and a snake tattoo slithering up his neck, leaned casually against the gate. "Well, look here, boys," the man drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "Grandpa's playing gardener." Martin straightened, gripping his shovel for support. His eyes met the bikers with unflinching determination. "The name's Martin Caldwell," he said, his voice steady. "Martin Caldwell," the man repeated with a smirk. "I'm Fong. And you'd best remember this is Viper territory now." To emphasize his claim, Fong leaned over the fence and spat onto Martin's freshly cleaned sidewalk. The other two bikers burst into laughter, their voices cutting through the quiet like a rusty blade. That night, the chaos reached a new level. Music blared from the warehouse well past midnight, shaking the walls of nearby homes. Martin sat in the darkness of his living room, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the photograph on the wall. It showed a young Martin, in his army uniform, standing proudly with his comrades, the faint outlines of a European village in the background. He stared at the photo, the memories of those hard-fought battles mingling with the frustration boiling in his chest. The shadows of the bikers danced across his yard as they stumbled around the street, their drunken antics echoing in the night. Martin thought of Eleanor, grateful she wasn't here to see their quiet neighborhood overrun. Yet her absence only strengthened his resolve. They had built this home together, filled it with memories and love, and he wasn't about to let anyone destroy that. As the clock struck midnight and the sound of a bottle shattering against his fence reached his ears, Martin made a decision. These men saw him as a frail old man, easy to intimidate. But they didn't know him, not really. He hadn't survived the worst days of the war just to bow to bullies. Tomorrow he would act, not alone, but with the support of those around him. His neighbors were frightened, but he knew fear could be overcome with the right leadership. By the weekend, the Crimson Vipers' revelry reached its peak. The music from their makeshift clubhouse rattled Martin's windows, louder and more obnoxious than ever. At 2 a.m., Martin sat at his bedroom window, watching the drunken bikers stumble into the street, tipping over trash cans and shouting at one another. One of them kicked at the stray tabby cat that had often slept on Martin's porch. The sight lit a spark of anger deep within him. At 2:30 a.m., Martin decided he'd had enough. He stood and grabbed his cane, slipping his navy blue cardigan over his striped pajamas. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out into the cool night air, determined to confront the chaos head-on. And slowly, Martin made his way outside. The cool night air brushed against his face as the distant stars flickered in the sky above. The music blaring from the warehouse seemed to grow louder with each deliberate step he took toward the chaos. Empty beer cans littered the street, crunching under his worn slippers as he approached. The neighborhood was silent apart from the racket, no lights in the windows, no curtains twitching. Everyone was too afraid to intervene. "Excuse me," Martin called out, his voice cutting through the noise with unexpected authority. It was the voice he had once used to command young soldiers in the middle of battlefields. It's past midnight, and people are trying to sleep. The music lowered slightly as a figure emerged from the warehouse doorway. Fong, the biker's leader, stepped into the dim glow of the streetlight, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. The snake tattoo winding up his neck seemed to shift and writhe with each movement. He held a half-empty bottle of beer in his hand, a smug grin plastered across his face. Behind him, 5 more bikers filed out, their boots thudding heavily against the ground. They spread into a loose half-circle around Martin, their leather vests emblazoned with the Crimson Cobra insignia glinting in the light. "Well, well," Fong drawled, his voice thick with mockery. "If it isn't Grandpa Green Thumb, out for a midnight stroll. Isn't it past your bedtime?" Martin gripped his cane tightly, his knuckles whitening. He stood tall, the years seeming to melt away from his posture. "The name's Martin Caldwell," he said, his tone even but firm. "And I'm asking you, respectfully, to turn down the music. People need their rest. Children have school in the morning." Fong's grin faltered for a moment, his amusement briefly replaced by annoyance. He stepped closer, the sharp tang of alcohol emanating from him. He loomed over Martin, towering by nearly a foot. "And what if we don't feel like it, Mr. Caldwell?" he sneered, drawing out the name like it was a punchline. "What's an old-timer like you gonna do about it?" Martin didn't flinch. "I've called the police 3 times already," he said calmly. "They'll be here any minute." Fong's face darkened, his grin replaced with a scowl. Without warning, he hurled his beer bottle to the ground, the glass shattering just inches from Martin's feet. The sound echoed sharply in the night. "You called the cops on us?" Fong snarled, turning to his crew. "Looks like Grandpa needs a little lesson in respect." 2 of the bikers broke away from the group and started toward Martin's yard. One kicked over his mailbox with a sharp metallic clang, the sound reverberating down the empty street. The other stepped into his garden, yanking out the azaleas Martin had tended with such care. The roots tore free from the soil, the delicate blooms crushed under heavy boots. "Stop this right now!" Martin shouted, his voice carrying across the street with a surprising strength that silenced even the bikers for a moment. His words were firm, unwavering. "You're destroying what doesn't belong to you. This is against the law." Fong laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "The law," he said mockingly, stepping toward Martin's flagpole. "We make the rules here now, old man." With a malicious grin, he grabbed the metal pole and gave it a violent shake. The pole groaned under the force, swaying unsteadily. "Don't touch that flag," Martin barked, his voice low and dangerous. In his mind, he wasn't standing in a quiet suburban street but back on the front lines, defending his post from an invading force. The air felt electric, charged with tension. But Fong didn't stop. With a hard pull, he yanked the flagpole from its base. It crashed to the ground, the clatter reverberating in Martin's chest. The flag, the symbol of everything he had fought for, fell into the dirt, smeared with mud. Something snapped inside Martin. Decades of discipline and restraint dissolved in an instant. He moved faster than he thought his old body could manage, stepping forward with determination. His cane swung out, catching Fong off guard. The younger man stumbled backward, his footing momentarily lost as he glared at the old veteran with a mixture of shock and fury. "You don't deserve to touch that flag," Martin growled, his voice steady and filled with the resolve of a man who had faced far worse adversaries. For a moment, the bikers hesitated, their leader scrambling to regain his composure. But Martin wasn't finished. Standing tall despite his years, he stared down the men before him, his gaze unwavering, his spirit unbroken. "You shouldn't have done that, old man," Fong growled, regaining his footing, his face a mask of rage. He clenched his fist, raising it as if to strike, but before he could follow through, the unmistakable wail of police sirens pierced the night. The sudden noise froze everyone in place for a moment, then Fong's expression darkened further. "This isn't over," he spat, pointing a threatening finger at Martin. "Not by a long shot." He turned to his gang and motioned sharply. Without hesitation, the bikers retreated toward the warehouse, their boots crunching over broken glass and scattered debris. They disappeared into the shadows as the sound of approaching engines grew louder. Minutes later, 2 police cars arrived, their red and blue lights flashing across the battered street. Officer Hernandez, a young patrolman with a tired but kind face, stepped out and approached Martin. He immediately noticed the bent flagpole and the mud-stained flag resting in Martin's trembling hands. "Mr. Caldwell," Officer Hernandez said gently as he helped lift the flag from the dirt, "I'll need you to file a report about what happened here. But, sir, I have to be honest. These guys are dangerous. Maybe it's best to avoid confronting them directly." Martin folded the flag carefully, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from a potent mix of anger and sorrow. He looked up at Hernandez, his eyes sharp despite the weight of his years. "Avoid them," Martin repeated, his voice low and firm. "That's what people said about bullies in 1939. You know what happened after that." Hernandez hesitated, unsure how to respond. After a brief silence, he nodded respectfully, then returned to his squad car. The police stayed just long enough to jot down notes and take a few photos, then drove off into the night, leaving Martin alone with the remnants of his once pristine yard. Back in his kitchen, Martin sat at the table, staring through the window at the wreckage illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. His azaleas, lovingly tended for decades, were now uprooted, their blooms scattered like discarded confetti. The mailbox lay twisted and crumpled by the curb. The flagpole, once a proud fixture, was bent and toppled, lying in the dirt like a defeated soldier. But what lingered most in Martin's mind wasn't the destruction. It was the fear he'd seen in Officer Hernandez's eyes. Fear that said the authorities couldn't, or wouldn't, protect this neighborhood. Fear that told Martin he was on his own. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, Martin reached for his old leather wallet. Hidden behind his driver's license and a creased photo of Eleanor, he found what he was looking for: a small, weathered card bearing the crest of the 82nd Airborne Division. He had kept it for over 70 years, a memento of a time when he'd stood shoulder to shoulder with men who would never back down from a fight. He traced the edges of the card with his thumb, his resolve hardening. "Maybe it's time," he muttered to himself. Martin made the call later that morning. He had hoped he would never have to dial the number, but the Crimson Vipers had made one critical mistake. They underestimated him. They thought they were dealing with a feeble old man. They had no idea they'd just woken a giant, and Martin Caldwell wasn't alone. The following days brought a wave of harassment from the Vipers. They were no longer content with noise and intimidation. Now, their actions became calculated, relentless. Every morning, Martin woke to find motorcycles parked across his driveway, blocking him in. When he called the towing company, the drivers would arrive, take one look at the Viper insignias, and leave without touching the bikes. Even the police seemed hesitant, patrolling less frequently and looking the other way whenever they passed the warehouse. By Monday morning, the Vipers escalated their game. Martin's trash cans were overturned, garbage strewn across his lawn. As he bent to clean up the mess, his back protesting every movement, 3 bikers sat on their motorcycles across the street, watching him with smug grins. "Need some help there, old man?" one of them called out, laughing. "Or maybe you should hire a maid. Assuming you can afford one." Martin ignored them, silently collecting the trash. His neighbors watched from behind their curtains, too afraid to step outside. Jenny's father, Mark, came halfway down his driveway, clearly torn between a desire to help and a need to protect his family. Martin saw him hesitate, then waved him off with a subtle shake of his head. "No need to put yourself or your family at risk," Martin thought to himself. By Wednesday, the harassment reached a boiling point. The Vipers introduced a new tactic they called Ring Around Caldwell. They circled Martin's house on their motorcycles, engines roaring like thunder, their exhaust fumes filling the air. The noise was deafening, the vibrations shaking the windows of his house. Inside, Martin stood at the window, gripping his cane tightly. He felt his anger simmering, but he didn't let it boil over. He had already made his move. Reinforcements were on the way, and soon, the Crimson Vipers would find out what it meant to cross someone like Martin Caldwell. The engines roared louder than ever as the bikers circled Martin's house, their motorcycles growling like restless predators. The noise was unbearable, so loud that even Pepper, Martin's stoic tabby cat, bolted through an open window, vanishing into the night. Martin hadn't seen him since. Meanwhile, Mrs. Greer, the kind woman from down the street, tried to deliver a batch of her famous apple pie to Martin. But as she approached his walkway, 2 bikers stepped into her path, their bulky frames blocking her way. "Sorry, lady," one of them sneered, his tone mocking. "This sidewalk is closed for business." Mrs. Greer hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched the warm pie. The bikers smirked, their laughter dripping with derision. She placed the pie on the ground and turned back, tears glistening in her eyes as she hurried away. The bikers watched her go, then casually kicked over the pie, leaving it splattered across the pavement. That evening, Martin sat alone in his kitchen, the air heavy with the weight of recent events. He opened a can of soup, his appetite dulled by frustration and sorrow. Earlier, his daughter Emily had called, her voice filled with concern. "Dad, I've been hearing about what's going on from the neighbors," she said, practically begging. "Please, come stay with us, just until things calm down." Martin's voice was steady as he replied, "This is my home, Emily. I didn't let enemy fire push me out of my foxhole in 44, and I'm not about to let these hoodlums run me out of my house in 2024. The next morning, Martin's resolve was tested again. As he stepped outside, he froze, his heart sinking at the sight before him. His once pristine lawn was a mess of chaos and destruction. Deep tire tracks crisscrossed the yard, gouging the earth in sharp, ugly lines. The azaleas that Eleanor had loved so much, planted together on their 30th wedding anniversary, were flattened into unrecognizable heaps. The neighbors who used to wave and smile now avoided his house entirely, crossing the street to avoid walking past. Not because they'd turned their backs on Martin, but because fear had taken hold of them. Later that afternoon, Officer Hernandez drove by in his patrol car, rolling down the window as he stopped in front of Martin's house. His face carried the weariness of someone who wanted to help but knew his hands were tied. "Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. Unless they physically harm someone, there's not much we can do. Maybe it's time to think about moving." Martin stood on his porch, staring at the ruin of his yard. The bent flagpole still lay where it had fallen, his garden was destroyed, and the black tire tracks scarred his once perfect lawn. Yet, as he surveyed the damage, something unshakable stirred within him. That evening, the bikers made their boldest move yet. Fong, their leader, led the charge, riding his motorcycle right up to Martin's front porch. The gang followed behind, their engines rumbling like thunder. Fong dismounted, pulling a can of red spray paint from his saddlebag. He walked up to Martin's garage door and began painting. The image of a coiled cobra quickly emerged, the gang's emblem, bold and menacing. Beneath it, Fong scrawled, "No VTS," in jagged, angry letters. The other bikers hooped and cheered, clapping Fong on the back as if he'd just claimed some great victory. Fong turned back toward the house, where Martin stood watching silently through the window. "This is your last warning, old man," Fong shouted, his voice carrying through the quiet neighborhood. "Next time, we won't be so nice." The bikers roared away moments later, their taillights fading into the night. Martin stayed at the window, his expression unreadable as he watched them disappear. Finally, he turned and walked to his bedroom with a quiet determination. From the bottom drawer of his dresser, Martin pulled out a small, weathered wooden box. He carried it to his bed, setting it down gently before lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was his military ID card, a relic from another life. Carefully, he unfolded the cloth, revealing the faded card with its frayed edges. On the back was a phone number he hadn't thought about in decades. Martin stared at the number for a moment, then reached for his phone. His hand didn't shake as he dialed, each press of the button deliberate and steady. Sometimes, he thought as the line began to ring, you fight fire with fire. Or, in this case, bikers with bikers. The Crimson Vipers thought they were untouchable, but they were about to learn the true meaning of resilience. The morning sun unveiled the full scope of the vandalism the Vipers had left behind. Martin stood in his driveway, his shoulders heavy as his eyes traced the crude graffiti scrawled across his garage door. The coiled crimson cobra painted there seemed almost alive, its menacing eyes daring him to respond. Beneath it, the jagged letters, "No VTS," felt like more than just a threat. It was an assault on his dignity, his home, and everything he'd stood for his entire life. Across the street, Mrs. Greer drove past without her usual friendly wave. Her grandson sat in the back seat, his small face pressed against the window, wide-eyed as he took in the destruction. He lifted his hand in a hesitant wave, but Mrs. Greer quickly pulled him back from the window, her face tight with worry. The neighborhood, once lively with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting, had fallen silent. Fear hung thick in the air, and Martin could feel its weight as he moved to the garage door, scrubbing at the garish paint with an old brush. Each stroke sent a sharp ache through his arthritic joints, but he refused to stop. He worked in determined silence until the now familiar growl of motorcycle engines broke the stillness. 3 Vipers pulled into his driveway, their engines roaring. Leading them was Hammer, Fong's second-in-command. His hulking frame leaned forward on his bike, a grin stretched across his scarred face. "Cleaning up our masterpiece, old man?" Hammer taunted, revving his engine with a laugh. "Shame, really. Fong spent a lot of time on that work of art." Martin didn't respond, keeping his focus on the garage door. But then, Hammer reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made Martin freeze. It was his American flag, the one they had ripped down days earlier. Now it was crumpled, smeared with dirt and streaked with motor oil. "Found this in the trash," Hammer sneered, holding it up for the others to see. "Thought you might want it back." Before Martin could react, Hammer tossed the flag onto the ground. The fabric fluttered lifelessly at Martin's feet, its stars and stripes marred by filth. Hammer drove forward, his tires rolling over the flag, leaving blackened streaks across its surface. Something inside Martin snapped. His hands trembled, but not from age or exhaustion. This was anger. White-hot, righteous anger. Images of his past flooded his mind. The faces of young soldiers who had fought beside him, their laughter, their fear, their sacrifice. Men who had died under that same flag. "You know what?" Martin said quietly, setting his brush down with deliberate care. "I've been too patient." The bikers chuckled, oblivious to the shift in his tone. Martin walked to his mailbox, now leaning awkwardly from where it had been kicked days earlier. Inside, nestled beneath today's mail, was his old leather wallet. He had placed it there that morning, knowing this moment might come. Slowly, he pulled it out, its worn edges smooth from decades of use. The bikers watched with amused smirks as Martin opened the wallet and removed a small, faded military ID card. Behind the card, a photograph of Eleanor peeked out, the edges yellowed with time. "What's that, Gramps?" "Your senior discount card." Hammer jeered, earning a round of laughter from the others. Martin didn't reply. His fingers ran over the ID card surface, the familiar feel of it grounding him. On the back, the faint ink of a phone number was still visible. He'd committed it to memory years ago, never imagining he'd need it. But as he glanced at the flag lying desecrated in his driveway, he knew the time had come. He turned, walking calmly toward his house. The bikers continued shouting insults, but for the first time in days, their words didn't bother him. Their jeers were background noise now, meaningless against the quiet resolve that had taken hold of him. Inside, Martin picked up his phone, the ID card still in his hand. He dialed the number with steady precision, each press of a button reminding him of the brotherhood he'd once been part of, a bond that never faded, no matter how many years passed. Sometimes, Martin thought as the line began to ring, you don't fight alone. Sometimes, you remind the world who you are, and who's still got your back. The number rang 3 times before a voice, gruff and direct, answered on the other end. "This is Martin Caldwell," he said clearly, his voice steady. "Army, 82nd Airborne, Normandy and beyond, service number 3-761-19. There was a brief pause. "Hold on, soldier," the voice responded, its tone shifting from skepticism to familiarity. After a moment, a second voice came on the line, older, grizzled, and full of quiet authority. "Martin Caldwell?" "The Caldwell from the St. Mire-Église operation." "Yes, sir," Martin replied, his heart beating a little faster. "It's been a long time, but if you're calling this number, it must be important." Martin didn't hesitate. "It is. I've got a problem, and I'm hoping the Brotherhood still stands." "Say no more, brother," the voice cut in, its tone resolute. "We take care of our own. Always have, always will. What's your location?" Martin gave his address, and as he spoke, he heard something in the background, motorcycles. But these weren't the harsh, erratic engines of the Crimson Vipers. These were controlled, powerful, and purposeful, like a well-rehearsed symphony. "Stay put, Caldwell," the voice said. "Help is coming. Plenty of it." The line clicked, leaving Martin standing in the quiet of his living room. He walked back to his front window, where Hammer and the other Vipers were still causing chaos outside. They revved their engines and shouted insults, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. They thought they were untouchable, their snake patches and smug grins the epitome of intimidation. Martin allowed himself a small smile. Soon, they would learn the truth. They would come to understand the difference between pretending to be strong and standing shoulder to shoulder with those who truly were. His gaze fell to the crumpled, soiled flag lying in his driveway. He could still see the tire marks that marred its once pristine stripes. Martin remembered the words of his old commanding officer in 1944, "The best battles are often the ones where you don't need to throw a punch. You just show up with the right people, and the fight ends before it begins." 2 hours after Martin made the call, the first signs of change rolled through the quiet suburban street. It began as a low rumble in the distance, different from the brash, discordant roar of the Vipers' motorcycles. This sound was deeper, rhythmic, and deliberate, like the drumbeat of an approaching army. The Crimson Vipers, lounging outside the warehouse and laughing over their antics, heard it too. Snake, reclined in a folding chair, squinted down the street. His grin faltered as the sound grew louder, coming from both ends of the road. He stood slowly, his face shifting from confusion to unease. Martin watched from his window as the first motorcycles appeared. These were not like the cobbled-together bikes of the Vipers. These were gleaming Harley-Davidsons, their chrome catching the sunlight, engines tuned to perfection. The riders wore leather vests, but these weren't adorned with serpents or threats. Instead, they bore American flags, military unit patches, and insignias that spoke of real battles fought and won. The riders arrived in waves, 5, then 10, then 20. Before long, over 50 motorcycles lined the street, coming from both directions and surrounding the Vipers' warehouse in a perfect, unbroken circle. Their movements were coordinated and calm, with none of the reckless noise-making the Vipers relied on. These men and women didn't need to yell or rev their engines to make their presence felt. They simply arrived, and that was enough. The veteran riders held their perfect circle around the warehouse, their presence a quiet but undeniable display of discipline and strength. These weren't loud troublemakers pretending to be tough. These were men and women who had proven their grit on real battlefields, forged by service, sacrifice, and camaraderie. A large motorcycle rolled up and stopped in front of Martin's house. Its rider, a tall woman in her 50s, climbed off with precision. Her silver hair was tied back in a tight braid, and her vest was adorned with combat medals and a patch that read Iron Lady. She was a Desert Storm veteran, and every step she took radiated authority. She approached Martin's door and knocked firmly. When Martin opened the door, she stood at attention and snapped a crisp salute. Senior Master Sergeant Sarah Martinez, U.S. Air Force, retired, she introduced herself. "We heard one of our brothers needed some help." Behind her, more veterans were dismounting their bikes, each one wearing their history of service like a badge of honor. There were Vietnam veterans with weathered faces and gray hair, Gulf War veterans in their 50s, and younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. Some walked with canes, others with prosthetic limbs, but every one of them moved with the unmistakable purpose of someone who had answered a call to duty. Martin looked at the gathering crowd, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke. "That's quite a response to one phone call." Iron Lady gave a small smile. "That number you called, it reached the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance. We've got chapters all over the country. And when we heard it was Martin Caldwell, the Martin Caldwell who parachuted into Normandy and held the line at St. Miraglisse, well, sir, people started riding in from 3 states away." Across the street, Snake and his gang had gathered in front of their warehouse. They were trying to maintain their bravado, leaning against their bikes and muttering to one another. But as more veterans arrived, their tough guy facade began to crack. The Crimson Vipers, who had once terrorized the street, now looked smaller, almost insignificant, against the backdrop of real warriors. One of the veterans, a large man with a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, knelt by the driveway where Martin's desecrated flag lay. His jaw tightened as he picked it up, his hands trembling with controlled anger. Carefully, with the precision of someone who had done it hundreds of times, he folded the flag into a tight triangle and approached Martin. "Permission to raise the colors, sir?" the Marine asked, his voice thick with respect. Martin nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The flagpole, repaired and standing tall once more, became the focus of everyone's attention as the Marine raised the flag with solemn reverence. Over 50 veterans snapped to attention, saluting in unison. Even neighbors watching from their windows, once too afraid to step outside, placed their hands over their hearts. Iron Lady turned then, her sharp eyes fixed on the Crimson Vipers. Her voice rang out across the street, calm but charged with authority. "We need to have a conversation about respect," she began, her tone steady, "especially respect for our World War II veterans." Snake tried to puff out his chest, his voice louder than it needed to be. "This is our territory now. You can't just—" "Your territory," a voice interrupted. It belonged to a veteran who had to be in his 70s. His posture slightly bent, but his presence unyielding. His voice boomed like thunder, silencing the gang instantly. "Son, the only territory here was paid for by the blood of men like Martin Caldwell, men who fought and died for the flag you just ran over." The street fell silent except for the faint rustle of the flag in the breeze. Snake shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence visibly waning as the weight of the veteran's presence settled over him like a storm cloud. More veterans began advancing toward the warehouse, their movements precise and deliberate, like a well-trained unit mobilizing into position. There was no shouting, no posturing, none of the bluster the Crimson Vipers relied on. The veterans didn't need to make threats. Their silent, coordinated presence was enough to fill the air with tension, a force that spoke louder than words. Martin stood on his porch, watching with a quiet sense of awe and gratitude as Iron Lady strode confidently down the street toward Snake. The sharp sound of her combat boots striking the asphalt echoed through the otherwise still neighborhood. The contrast between them was striking. Iron Lady, who had faced real combat zones, versus Snake, a man who had only ever tried to look dangerous. "Now then," Iron Lady said, stopping a few feet from Snake, her voice steady and clear. "Let's talk about how things are going to change around here." The Crimson Vipers shuffled uneasily, their bravado quickly draining as they realized they were surrounded by people who had faced far greater challenges than they could imagine. Snake tried to keep his composure, but even he was visibly rattled. The sun reflected off the medals and unit patches on the veterans' vests, a gleaming testament to the battles they'd fought and the sacrifices they'd made. The Red Serpents were starting to understand a crucial lesson. There's a world of difference between acting tough and being strong. And true strength, as Martin had always believed, came not from intimidation, but from unity, honor, and standing up for what was right. Iron Lady planted her boots firmly in the center of Seta Street, her presence commanding. The gang huddled near the warehouse, their earlier confidence slipping with each passing second. "First things first," Iron Lady said, her tone brooking no argument. "You're going to clean up every bit of damage you've done to Mr. Caldwell's property. Every tire track, every piece of trash, every drop of paint." Snake squared his shoulders, attempting to puff himself up. "And if we don't," he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. An older veteran stepped forward, his Vietnam service medal gleaming on his chest. His face was calm, but his tone was as sharp as a bayonet. "Then we make some calls," he said evenly. "We've got brothers and sisters in every police department, courthouse, and city office in this state. One call about the building code violations in this warehouse." He let the implication hang in the air like a blade. Another veteran, younger and walking with a prosthetic leg from the Iraq War, pulled out his phone. "Already got pictures of those illegal modifications on your bikes. My sister works at the DMV. She'd love to take a closer look at these." The Crimson Vipers exchanged uneasy glances, their tough guy facade beginning to crack. Snake's second-in-command, Hammer, stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "You can't prove anything," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Iron Lady smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be reassuring. "Actually, we can," she said, pulling out a folder from her saddlebag. "Those security cameras Mr. Caldwell installed last week? Military grade. Crystal clear, even at night. Every single thing you've done is recorded." The silence that followed was deafening. The Vipers stood frozen, their false confidence crumbling as the weight of Iron Lady's words sank in. Their reign of terror had been documented, their every act of vandalism caught on tape. For the first time, they realized they weren't facing scared civilians. They were up against people who knew exactly how to take them down, and do it legally. Snake's face turned ashen as the implications sank in. He glanced nervously at the corners of the street, now spotting the tiny, nearly invisible security cameras. He hadn't noticed them before, and now it was too late. His gang shifted uneasily, the cracks in their confidence widening. But Iron Lady wasn't finished. She pulled out another set of papers, her expression hard and unyielding. "While you boys were busy harassing a World War II hero," she began, "we were busy doing a little research." Her eyes locked on Snake. Snake, or should I say Robert Wilson, you've got 3 outstanding warrants in 2 different states. The gang members turned to their leader, their faces a mix of confusion and betrayal. Snake had always told them he was on the run because he was too dangerous to be caught. Now, they were discovering the truth. He wasn't a legend, he was a fugitive hiding behind a tough guy act. And Hammer's got some paperwork problems too, chimed in another veteran, holding up a sheet of documents. Iron Lady gestured toward the warehouse. And that building you're squatting in? It belongs to a Marine Corps veteran. He's been very interested in the damage you've done to his property. He's already signed off on pressing charges. The Crimson Vipers began to shuffle backward, putting space between themselves and their so-called leader. Snake's facade was crumbling, the foundation of his intimidation collapsing under the weight of his exposed identity. Iron Lady raised her voice slightly, making sure the gang could hear every word. Here's how this is going to play out. You're going to clean up every last bit of damage you've done. You're going to apologize to Mr. Caldwell and everyone else you've harassed in this neighborhood. Then you're going to pack up and leave this street, and you're never coming back. Snake, desperate to salvage what little remained of his reputation, straightened his back and tried one last time to sound defiant. And if we refuse, he challenged, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. A deep, booming voice answered from behind him. Then we stay. It was the Marine veteran who had folded Martin's flag. His presence was as commanding as his voice. We camp out here, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every time you try to sleep, we'll be doing engine maintenance. Every time you try to party, we'll be holding veterans choir practice. And believe me, we've got the numbers to keep this up for years. Martin, watching from his porch, saw the moment Snake's resistance broke. His shoulders slumped as he looked around at his gang members, who were already retreating, unwilling to meet his eyes. Fine, Snake muttered, his tone defeated. We'll clean it up. Start with the flag paint on Mr. Caldwell's garage, Iron Lady ordered, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. And while you're working, she added, some of us would love to share stories about what real toughness looks like. Like how Mr. Caldwell parachuted into enemy territory on D-Day or held the line at St. Mire-Église under relentless fire. For the next several hours, the Crimson Vipers scrubbed, swept, and repaired the damage they had caused. Snake and Hammer worked on removing the graffiti from Martin's garage, their faces flushed with embarrassment as veterans stood nearby, supervising their efforts with calm but unrelenting authority. The street came alive with activity. Neighbors began stepping out of their houses, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they saw the Vipers humbled. Children who hadn't played outside in weeks peeked out from behind their doors, watching curiously. For the first time in months, laughter and conversation began to replace fear and silence. Martin, standing tall on his porch, felt a swell of pride and gratitude as he watched the veterans uphold the values he'd spent his life defending: honor, unity, and the unbreakable strength of true brotherhood. Other gang members, now visibly subdued, repaired Martin's garden with the same hands that had destroyed it days before. They carefully re-erected his mailbox, cleared away trash, and began restoring the flower beds they had trampled. Veterans stood nearby, ensuring that every bit of damage was made right, their watchful presence a constant reminder of accountability. Martin sat on his porch in his favorite chair, a cup of coffee in hand, surrounded by the veterans who had come to his aid. They shared their service stories, tales of bravery, camaraderie, and sacrifice. Each story served as a powerful reminder of what courage, brotherhood, and respect truly meant. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows began to venture outside, drawn by the warmth of the scene unfolding before them. By late afternoon, 2 police cars pulled up in front of the warehouse. Officer Hernandez stepped out, accompanied by deputies from nearby counties. Robert Wilson, one of the deputies, called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. You're under arrest for those outstanding warrants. Snake, still visibly shaken, was led away in handcuffs. The gang leader who had once terrorized the neighborhood now looked small and defeated, his tough guy persona stripped away completely. Iron Lady turned to Martin, her expression softening into a genuine smile. Mission accomplished, she said simply. Martin glanced around at his restored property, the repaired garden, the cleaned garage, and the fresh flag flying proudly above it all. He watched as Snake was loaded into the police car and driven away. Mission accomplished, he agreed, his voice full of gratitude. But please, stay for dinner. Eleanor taught me how to make a pot roast that could feed an army. As word of Snake's arrest spread through the neighborhood, the mood on Center Street began to change. By sunset, the street felt transformed, as if a heavy cloud had been lifted. Laughter and conversation returned, children began to play outside again, and a sense of safety was restored. In Martin's living room, the veterans gathered, sharing coffee and swapping stories from their years of service. Some spoke of battles fought overseas. Others recalled quieter acts of heroism. Martin sat among them, a quiet smile on his face, listening to the bond they all shared, a bond that had come to his rescue when he needed it most. Iron Lady, always organized and efficient, had already formed teams of veteran bikers to help restore the neighborhood further. A group worked tirelessly on Martin's garden, replanting his cherished azaleas and removing every trace of motorcycle tracks from the lawn. Another group focused on cleaning up the mess left behind at the warehouse, scrubbing graffiti from the walls and clearing out debris. Mr. Caldwell, Officer Hernandez said as he stepped into the living room, holding a notebook filled with scribbled notes. "We found some interesting things in that warehouse. Turns out Snake and his gang were involved in more than just causing noise. There's evidence of stolen motorcycle parts, illegal weapons, and drug activity. This operation will likely lead to charges for the entire group." The remaining Crimson Vipers, those without serious criminal records, had scattered after Snake's arrest. Most were little more than young troublemakers who had been following a bad leader. Without Snake's influence, they had no desire to stick around or cause more problems. "What's going to happen to the warehouse now?" Martin asked, glancing out the window where veterans were hard at work, carefully scrubbing the last bits of graffiti from the building's exterior. Iron Lady pulled a set of documents from her leather jacket, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. "Funny you should ask," she said, spreading the papers out on Martin's coffee table. "This," she continued, tapping the top document, "is a proposal to turn the warehouse into a community center run by veterans. A safe space for the neighborhood, where kids can come after school, neighbors can gather, and anyone who needs help can find it." Martin's heart swelled with pride and hope as he looked at the plans. "That," he said after a moment, "sounds like exactly what this neighborhood needs." Iron Lady nodded, her eyes sparkling with determination. "We're going to make sure this street stays safe, and we'll honor your fight to protect it, Martin." "That's what we do." For the first time in weeks, Martin felt truly at peace. His neighborhood was not just restored, it was on its way to becoming stronger than ever, thanks to the people who understood the value of service and the true meaning of community. "That's the best part, sir," Iron Lady said, a glint of excitement in her eyes. "The owner of the warehouse, the Marine Corps veteran I mentioned, has decided to donate the building to the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance. We're thinking of turning it into a community center." The other veterans nodded in agreement, their enthusiasm palpable. One of them, a former Army engineer with a pencil tucked behind his ear, had already begun sketching plans on the back of a napkin. "We could have a meeting space for veterans," he said, his pencil moving quickly. "A workshop to teach kids motorcycle maintenance. Maybe even a small museum dedicated to local military history and heroism." Just then, Mrs. Greer appeared at Martin's door with a large tray of her famous apple pie. This time, no one stopped her, and the smile on her face was one of gratitude and relief. "These are for everyone," she said warmly. "Thank you all for bringing peace back to our street." The sense of safety and camaraderie began to ripple outward. More neighbors started to emerge, each contributing something to the gathering. Jenny and her father brought out a cooler filled with cold drinks, which they passed around to the veterans working outside. Mrs. Chen arrived shortly after, carrying a steaming tray of dumplings. "These are for all of you," she said, her voice brimming with gratitude. Even Pepper, Martin's wayward cat, made his return, weaving between the legs of the tough-looking bikers, purring loudly as if he had found his own way of saying thanks. Iron Lady, surveying the scene with a thoughtful smile, turned to Martin. "You know what this street needs," she said, her voice carrying over the cheerful chatter. "A proper flag ceremony every morning. You shouldn't have to raise the colors alone anymore, Mr. Caldwell." The veterans agreed unanimously. It was decided right then and there. Every morning at 7 a.m., any veterans in the area would join Martin for the flag raising. It would be more than a ritual. It would be a daily reminder of the values the flag represented: service, community, and the strength that came from standing together. As the evening light softened into a golden glow, Martin's daughter Emily arrived, worry etched across her face. She had heard about the arrests and the excitement from a neighbor and rushed over to check on her father. She found him surrounded by his new friends, confidently sharing his famous pot roast recipe with a group of veterans who hung on his every word as if he were their commanding officer. "Dad," Emily said, pulling him into a tight hug. "Are you okay? I've been so worried about everything going on." Martin smiled warmly, patting her hand. "Never better, sweetheart. This whole thing just reminded me of something I learned back in '44. Sometimes, the best family isn't the one you're born with, it's the one you find along the way." Outside, the veterans had strung up lights across the street, transforming what had started as a cleanup effort into an impromptu block party. Laughter filled the air as children, who had been hiding inside for days, now ran freely, playing games and exploring the gleaming motorcycles parked along the curb. The veterans knelt down to show the kids how the bikes worked, their faces lighting up as the children asked excited questions. Just as the party was hitting its stride, Officer Hernandez returned, stepping carefully through the crowd of cheerful neighbors and veterans. His expression was serious but tinged with satisfaction. "Mr. Caldwell," Hernandez said, holding a small notebook in his hand, "we've got even more news about what we found in that warehouse." "The warehouse has been officially cleared by the police," Officer Hernandez announced, a satisfied smile on his face. "And get this, the city council just held an emergency meeting. They fast-tracked the permits to turn it into a veterans community center." A cheer erupted from the gathered crowd. What had once been a street overshadowed by fear was now filled with the sound of laughter, music, and the irresistible aroma of shared meals. Neighbors and veterans mingled freely, their stories weaving a new fabric of connection and resilience. Plans for the community center took shape as ideas flowed, from workshops to classes, to ways to honor those who had served. As the night deepened, Martin stood on his porch, surveying his restored property. His garden had been replanted with care, the flagpole stood tall and unyielding, and the American flag flew high, its colors bold against the darkening sky. Cedar Street, once shrouded in tension, now felt like home again. But more importantly, it now had something it never had before, a sense of true unity and protection, born not from intimidation, but from shared strength, service, and mutual respect. Iron Lady stepped up onto the porch, her hands resting on her hips as she watched the neighborhood kids learning to fold an American flag under the guidance of a patient veteran. "You know, sir," she said, her voice warm, "this is just the beginning. Wait until you see what we have planned for this community." Martin smiled, his heart full as he took in the scene before him. "I can't wait to see it," he said, his voice steady. "But first, I think we need more pot roast. Looks like I've got a lot of new family members to feed." 6 months later, Cedar Street was unrecognizable from the place it had been. The old warehouse, once a stronghold of fear and chaos, now stood proudly as the Veterans Community Center. Its walls were freshly painted in navy blue, adorned with military flags and plaques honoring local heroes. Inside, its halls bustled with activity nearly every hour of the day. Every morning at 7 a.m., Martin stepped out onto his porch for the flag-raising ceremony. He was never alone anymore. On most mornings, 15 to 20 veterans joined him, their motorcycles lined neatly along the street. Some days, the numbers were even higher, especially when Iron Lady organized her veterans' breakfast meetings, which had quickly become a beloved tradition. The community center had become the heartbeat of the neighborhood. After school, local kids flocked to the center for free motorcycle maintenance classes, where veterans taught them not just mechanics, but life lessons about discipline and respect. Mrs. Chen ran a weekly cooking class that brought families together, sharing her treasured dumpling recipes. Jenny, the tech-savvy teen, had her own space in the center, where she helped veterans navigate the world of smartphones and computers. This morning, however, was especially meaningful. Martin stood in his garden, a place that had become even more beautiful than it was before the Crimson Viper's rampage. The veterans had gone above and beyond, planting new varieties of flowers, including a special white rose bush they named Martha's Memory, in honor of Martin's late wife. Iron Lady walked up the driveway, her formal veteran's attire gleaming with polished medals. Her demeanor was as confident as ever, but today there was a special excitement in her step. "Ready for the big day, Mr. Caldwell," she called out, her smile wide. Martin turned, his eyes sparkling. "As ready as I'll ever be. Let's make this a day to remember." Today marked the first annual Cedar Street Veterans Festival, an event the entire neighborhood had spent weeks preparing for. The festival promised food, music, games, and stories. An opportunity to honor the past while celebrating the future of a community that had grown stronger together. Martin glanced at the flagpole in his yard, the colors fluttering proudly in the morning breeze. For the first time in a long time, he felt the deepest kind of peace, the kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged, surrounded by family in every sense of the word. The streets were alive with celebration. American flags waved from every post, and the irresistible aroma of barbecue filled the air as Mrs. Rodriguez and her family grilled their famous tacos in the Veterans Community Center's new kitchen. Children ran through the street, their laughter blending with the hum of excitement. Cedar Street had come a long way, and today, it was shining like never before. "Born ready," Martin said with a grin, using Iron Lady's real name. Over the past 6 months of morning coffee and shared stories, they had become more than allies. They were close friends. The festival wasn't just a celebration, it was a testament to how one person's courage could ignite an entire community. People came from all over the state, veterans, families, and even a few former Crimson Vipers who had turned their lives around after Snake's arrest. Martin's daughter Emily arrived early, carrying a large photo album. She placed it carefully on a table near the entrance of the community center. The album told the story of Cedar Street's transformation, from the dark days of the gang's reign to the vibrant, thriving neighborhood it had become. The last photo in the album, taken just yesterday, showed Martin surrounded by smiling children as he taught them how to fold the American flag properly. "Dad," Emily said, wrapping her arms around him tightly, "I can't believe how different everything is now. Remember when I begged you to move away?" Martin chuckled, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "Sometimes running away isn't the answer," he said softly. "Sometimes you have to stand your ground and call the right people." By noon, the festival was in full swing. Veterans from 5 states had ridden in on their motorcycles, their bikes forming an awe-inspiring display in front of the community center. Officer Hernandez, now promoted to sergeant, brought his entire police department to enjoy the free barbecue. Even the mayor made an appearance, presenting Martin with a key to the city for his role in transforming the neighborhood. But the day's most emotional moment came when Iron Lady called for everyone's attention. She stood in front of the community center's main wall, a large sheet draped over it. "We've got a special surprise," Iron Lady announced, her voice carrying through the excited crowd. "This place has become a symbol of hope, strength, and community. And there's one person who inspired all of it." With a firm tug, she pulled the sheet away, unveiling a stunning mural. It depicted a young Martin Caldwell in his army uniform, standing proud and resolute on the battlefield. Below the image, bold letters read, "Martin Caldwell Community Center, where courage meets community." The crowd erupted in applause, but Martin stood motionless for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. Iron Lady stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We wanted to rename it," she explained, her voice soft but steady. "Because this place, this whole change in the neighborhood, it started with you. One brave man who refused to be bullied and showed everyone that true strength isn't about intimidation. It's about bringing people together." Tears welled in Martin's eyes as he turned to look at the bustling street. What had once been a place of fear and silence was now alive with joy and connection. Children played freely, their laughter ringing out as veterans taught them about respect and honor. Neighbors who had once kept their doors shut now stood together, chatting and sharing food. Even the sound of motorcycles, once a symbol of menace, had transformed. Now, it was the sound of friends arriving, eager to share stories, lend a hand, or simply enjoy the camaraderie. Martin felt a nudge at his ankle and glanced down to see Pepper, now the unofficial mascot of the Veterans Center, rubbing against his legs. He reached down to scratch the cat behind the ears, his gaze drifting to the flagpole in his yard, where the American flag flew proudly against the clear blue sky. "You know what, old friend?" Martin whispered to Pepper, his voice filled with emotion. "Sometimes the best battles aren't fought with fists or weapons. They're won with a phone call to the right people at the right time." And as the sun set over Cedar Street, Martin knew this victory wasn't just his, it belonged to the entire community. Together, they had proven that real strength came from unity, and that even in the darkest of times, one call for help could spark a brighter future. As the festival buzzed around him, Martin Caldwell, the 91-year-old veteran whose quiet bravery had sparked an extraordinary change, sat in his favorite porch chair, surrounded by his new family. Proof that courage, honor, and brotherhood never lose their relevance, no matter how much time passes. 6 months had passed since the phone call that had changed everything. Cedar Street had become a beacon of hope, a neighborhood reborn. The old warehouse, once a symbol of fear and chaos, now stood proudly as the Veterans Community Center, its walls freshly painted navy blue and adorned with military flags and plaques honoring local heroes. Every morning at 7 a.m., Martin stepped out onto his porch for the flag-raising ceremony. He was never alone anymore. On most days, 15 to 20 veterans joined him, their motorcycles parked neatly along the street, their presence a reassuring reminder of the bond they shared. Some mornings saw even more, especially when Iron Lady hosted her famous veterans breakfast meetings, which had become a cherished tradition in the area. The center had become the heartbeat of the community. Local kids flocked there after school to attend free motorcycle maintenance classes taught by the veterans, who didn't just teach mechanics but also shared invaluable lessons about respect and discipline. Mrs. Chen ran a weekly cooking class, drawing military families together as she passed on her treasured dumpling recipes. Jenny had her own corner in the building, where she patiently guided veterans through the world of smartphones and technology, helping them connect with family and friends far away. On this particular morning, the energy on Cedar Street was electric. Martin stood in his garden, admiring its transformation. The veterans had gone above and beyond in restoring it, planting not only his beloved azaleas but also a special white rose bush named Martha's memory in honor of his late wife. "Ready for the big day, Mr. Caldwell?" Iron Lady called, walking up his driveway with her usual confidence. She was dressed in her formal veteran's attire, her polished medals gleaming in the sun. "Born ready," Martin replied with a grin, calling her by her real name. Over the past 6 months, their bond had deepened through countless cups of morning coffee and shared stories of service. Today was the first annual Cedar Street Veterans Festival, an event that had united the entire neighborhood in preparation. Streets were draped in American flags, and the tantalizing aroma of barbecue filled the air as Mrs. Rodriguez and her family grilled their famous tacos in the community center's new kitchen. But the festival was more than a celebration. It was a testament to how one person's courage could ripple outward, transforming an entire community. People traveled from all over the state to join in, veterans, families, and even a few former Crimson Vipers who had turned their lives around after Snake's arrest. Martin's daughter Emily arrived early, holding a large photo album filled with snapshots of Cedar Street's transformation. She placed it on a table for everyone to see. The final photo, taken just a day earlier, showed Martin surrounded by beaming children, teaching them the art of proper flag etiquette. "Dad," Emily said as she hugged him tightly, her voice tinged with emotion, "I can't believe how much has changed. Remember when I wanted you to move away?" Martin chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Sometimes running away isn't the answer," he said, patting her hand. "Sometimes you need to stand your ground and call the right people." The festival was in full swing by noon. Veterans from 5 states roared in on their motorcycles, forming a breathtaking display in front of the community center. Sergeant Hernandez arrived with his entire police department, eager to enjoy the free barbecue. Even the mayor showed up, presenting Martin with a key to the city in honor of his role in transforming the neighborhood. The most poignant moment of the day came when Iron Lady called for the crowd's attention. She stood before the community center's main wall, which was covered by a large cloth. "We wanted to do something special," Iron Lady began, her voice steady and filled with warmth. "This center has become a symbol of what's possible when people come together. And it all started with one man who refused to back down. With a dramatic pull, she unveiled the wall, revealing a stunning mural. It depicted a young Martin Caldwell in his army uniform, standing resolutely amid the chaos of war. Below the image, bold letters read, "Martin Caldwell Community Center, where courage meets community." The crowd erupted in applause, neighbors and veterans alike cheering as Martin stared at the mural in stunned silence, his eyes welling with tears. Iron Lady stepped forward, her voice softer now. "This place, this neighborhood, none of it would be what it is today without you, Martin. You showed us all that true strength isn't about fear or intimidation. It's about standing tall, protecting what matters, and bringing people together." Martin looked around at the bustling street. The laughter of children filled the air as veterans taught them the value of honor and respect. Neighbors who once avoided each other now laughed and shared stories over plates of food. Even the hum of motorcycles, once a source of dread, had become a welcome sound, proof that friends and protectors had arrived. As if sensing the gravity of the moment, Pepper nudged against Martin's leg, purring loudly. Martin bent down to stroke his loyal cat and glanced up at the flagpole, where the stars and stripes waved proudly against the afternoon sky. "You know something, old friend?" Martin said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. "Sometimes the best battles aren't fought with fists or weapons. They're won with a phone call to the right people at the right time." And as the sun began to set on Cedar Street, Martin knew this was more than just a victory. It was the start of something lasting, proof that when a community comes together, no challenge is insurmountable. The festival was alive with energy by noon. Veterans from 5 states had arrived on their motorcycles, their impressive display of gleaming chrome lining the streets in front of the center. Families wandered among them, admiring the custom decals and military patches that told stories of battles fought and sacrifices made. Sergeant Hernandez, now leading the local police department, showed up with his entire team to enjoy the free barbecue, exchanging laughter and stories with neighbors and veterans alike. Even the mayor attended, bringing with him a key to the city, which he proudly presented to Martin Caldwell for his unwavering courage and pivotal role in transforming Cedar Street. But the most unforgettable moment came when Iron Lady stepped forward and called for the crowd's attention. All eyes turned to her as she stood in front of the Veterans Community Center's main wall, which had been covered with a large cloth. "This neighborhood has come a long way," she began, her voice carrying across the gathering. "It's become a place of safety, hope, and unity. And all of it started with one man's decision to stand his ground." With a firm tug, she unveiled the mural behind her. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they saw the stunning image, a young Martin Caldwell in his army uniform, standing tall and proud amid a battlefield, his expression resolute. Beneath the mural, bold letters read, "Martin Caldwell Community Center, where courage meets community." The applause was thunderous, and Martin stood motionless for a moment, his breath caught in his chest. Tears welled in his eyes as he read the inscription and looked at the faces of his neighbors, veterans, and friends, his new family. Iron Lady stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Martin's shoulder. "We wanted to rename it," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "Because everything you see here, this new beginning for Cedar Street, it all started with you. One brave man who refused to be bullied and reminded us that true strength isn't about intimidation. It's about bringing people together." Martin's gaze swept across the street. Children played freely, laughing as veterans taught them the proper way to fold an American flag. Neighbors who once kept to themselves were now deep in conversation, sharing food and laughter instead of fear and silence. The hum of motorcycles, once a symbol of menace, now carried a message of unity and friendship. At his feet, Pepper purred and rubbed against his legs, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Martin bent down to stroke his faithful cat, his thoughts drifting to Eleanor and how proud she would be of everything they had accomplished together. "You know something, old friend?" Martin whispered to Pepper, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Sometimes the best battles aren't fought with fists or weapons. They're won with a phone call to the right people at the right time." As the festival carried on, Martin Caldwell, the 91-year-old veteran who had turned his street into a beacon of hope, sat back in his favorite porch chair. Around him were the people who mattered most, veterans, neighbors, and children who now called Cedar Street home. Proof that courage, honor, and brotherhood never go out of style.